Uh, so good evening, everyone. So dear colleagues, so welcome to the Abstract and Research Writing Workshop. It is my honor to introduce our distinguished speaker today, the Professor Michelle Hermison. Dr. Hermison is a professor of pediatrics at University of California at San Francisco School of Medicine. She is a board-certified pediatric hematology oncology specialist. She joined the UCSF in 2002 and held various clinical, academic, and administrative positions. Currently, she is a clinical director of the Pediatrics Immunotherapy Program at UCSF's Panyope Children's Hospital, an associated director of UCSF's Helen Diller Comprehensive Cancer Center Global Oncology Program. Her research interest is immune dysregulation, MSA, HLS, LCA, palliative care, educational innovation, and global oncology. Dr. Hermison is author of hundreds of book chapters and peer-reviewed articles in scientific journals. She is a reviewer of various scientific journals and is a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Pediatric Hematology and Oncology. The topic of her talk today is how to share your awesome work to the world. And please join me to welcome Dr. Hermison.
Thank you for the very kind introduction. So we can see my slides. I want to thank you for inviting us here and for the opportunity to be here. And I'm excited to discuss this topic. This topic came from a conversation that I had with Dr. Lan and Dr. Fu in the leadership committee for the Bone Marrow Transplant Consortium for Vietnam. And one of the needs that they recognized was concerning how to publish, how to do abstracts and those things. And I think this is my 12th or 13th time to Vietnam. It's so nice to be back after the pandemic. And one of the things that I've really come to appreciate is that you guys are doing amazing work here. And how do we help support you communicating that to the world? So what I'm going to try, we have something in our institution called Fellows College, where we do this training over a 3-year period of time. And I tried to take the key points and put it all into a 2-hour workshop. So we'll see how far we get. And I'm happy to leave these slides and to share all of this information and to answer questions you might have. But I thought I would start with, how do you develop your research idea? How do you establish a mentorship team? What's the recipe for writing a winning abstract, a successful poster, a research presentation? And if you do each of those things, this is the kind of typical progression of things in academic settings, then you're ready to write a research paper that hopefully will be published and shared with the world. And then I think in the context of all of this and your professional career, it's helpful to think about, how do you network at professional meetings? Because that networking actually helps you get published and it helps you get grant funding. And so I think that can be important. So it can be rather daunting sometimes to sit down and write a paper, but I want you to think about, it's not rocket science. Take a deep breath. I view this process much more like baking, and my goal is to provide you a recipe for success. Like baking, the ingredients you choose are important. You need to have good data, and it needs to be high quality. And that's kind of a whole different talk, but also something our team is happy to help with. So thinking about your idea and establishing your mentor team, it's important to start at the very beginning. Most of the time, people don't have automatically a great idea, and that's okay. Right? We tell our fellows, don't panic, it will come. What are the components of a great idea? It should be interesting. It should be novel. It should be underexplored. It should be feasible. You can actually do it. It's helpful to start with a question. So be curious. What do you want to know more about? What does everybody in the field want to know more about? If you answer your question, it will teach us something new. It's contributing new knowledge and it's moving the field forward. So as you think about things, if somebody's already published exactly the same thing, it's unlikely to get published a second time. And many journals from the reviewer side will actually show you all of the papers in that topic area. So you need to think about, is this new? Is it important and interesting? And your job as you write your abstract or do your poster or do your presentation or write your paper is to convince the audience it's interesting and it's important. So in terms of getting started, it's helpful, I think, especially for people who don't have a lot of experience with this yet, to collect background and critically analyze the field. As I said, you don't usually have a great idea from the start, so you need to read a lot and really spend some time in PubMed to find out what is out there. Look for papers that might answer the question you're interested in and see what's there. Your goals during the reading time are to define what's known. And so I encourage our fellows to keep a running list or summary of the papers they're reading, to examine how reliable that knowledge is. Is it good data? Is it bad data? What are the gaps? What don't we know? And a place to look for that is when you read a paper, look in the discussion. That last paragraph usually has what the next steps should be or what the questions are. And then ask what you can contribute to the field. And I think it's important to seek feedback from your mentorship team. So in our institution, we actually do an entire hour-long workshop on being a mentee and choosing your mentors. And mentor can mean many different things. It can be a teacher, it can be a sponsor. And what a sponsor means in terms of mentorship is someone who will help promote your career, introduce you to people, share their network. It can be a guide. It can be an example or a role model. It can be someone who gives advice and provides counseling, but they should take personal interest in you. And I think, I'm not good at math. Let's see, there we go. Okay, so how do you find mentors? When you go to meetings, you'll often see people like, I would be interested in talking to them. And I think I learned from one of my mentors is that asking is free. And many people will feel very flattered and complimented if you say, I'd like to meet with you or talk with you. And so I think a lot of more junior people feel very timid to go meet people, but it's okay. I mean, the worst they can say is no. And the vast majority of time, they're going to be excited to talk with you. The minimum mentorship team that we have all of our trainees develop is a research mentor. This should be someone that can help you develop the skills you need to complete the work. For our fellows in Vietnam, we have mandated that they have somebody in country who's more senior. And then we also pair them with one or two international content experts. It's helpful to have a content expert for every aspect of your project because no one knows everything. So I can be a content expert for somebody who's working on hyperinflammatory disorder, but I'm not the world's best biostatistician. So they also need a mentor who can help with the their content is data analysis. You should look for somebody who can be a career mentor. I think for people in Vietnam, looking at somebody that you admire and you want to be like is a good career mentor. And then it's helpful to have somebody who is sort of serves the role of life mentor that has similar family responsibilities or personal experiences that can help you maintain work-life balance and discuss those things. And so in our system, we ask our fellows to identify mentors in each of those areas. And you can certainly have more than that. Caitlin Duffy, Dr. Caitlin Duffy is here from St. Jude with me, and she's just finished fellowship. So I've asked her to kind of chip in when she has comments that from that perspective can be helpful. So we're going to go into writing an abstract. And usually when you're doing some type of research project, the first step is before the data is completely mature and you've got all of your analysis done, is to submit this to a meeting. And you can kind of find out what people like, what people don't like about it. And it's a nice first step for getting towards the ultimate goal of publishing the paper in a peer-reviewed journal. So what's the recipe for a great abstract? It's important to remember that abstracts are required summaries. You use them for presentations, posters, publications, research studies. The overall goal of an abstract is to succinctly summarize the highlights of the work. There's usually a word limit. It usually feels like there's no way you can get everything in that word limit, but trying to really be succinct of the highlights. You don't have to state everything. The purpose of an abstract is to make the audience excited to hear your talk or read your work or go to your poster. And most abstracts actually follow a very similar structure format. And so you can, essentially follow that format and write your abstract. One hint is to read and follow instructions for the specific place you're submitting your work, because it's always a little bit different, and to look at successful examples from that setting. The general structure is usually have your title, the introduction, which is really, sometimes it's called purpose or hypothesis, the methods, the results, and the conclusions. And so look at ones that have been accepted in the same journal, and that will give you a good pattern to structure that on, Keelan.
I will say that something I found helpful is talk with your mentors. And oftentimes if it's like a big conference, they may have also submitted prior abstracts to that. And so if you're not exactly sure or don't know where to find a previous version, often your mentors can help give you an example of one that they've submitted in the past.
And so some pros for success: read and follow the instructions for the abstract. And that's really important because it shows you're a careful clinician scientist, and it really is like making your good first impression. Some abstracts will want one paragraph. Some abstract instructions will have subheadings. Sometimes they like to have a space between the subheadings. Sometimes they want it all in a paragraph form. So follow the instructions. Sometimes they require specific fonts or specific margins. So it seems detailed and boring, but as a reviewer of abstracts for meetings, I've had to just throw good science out because they didn't follow the instructions. Sometimes they will have the review criteria in the meeting abstract instructions. So make sure you follow those and address those points. You want to be clear and concise summary of your work. So be internally consistent. Do your numbers add up? Do they address the question or hypothesis you state? I've read abstracts where they say, this is my hypothesis, but then they show me no data and they have no conclusions that actually go back to that hypothesis. So you want it to be consistent. You want to sell your work and tell the audience why it's exciting and matters. You should be honest, don't oversell it, but you want your enthusiasm for your work to come through. Because English is a second language here, it's really important to have someone proofread for grammar in English, and we have a whole team of people that are happy to do that, so just reach out to us. It's also helpful to read it out loud. My lab mate, when I was in graduate school, was from China, and she would actually tape herself and then listen to it back. And does it sound right to you that way? And so that can be helpful to look at. Another tip, and this comes up more when we talk about presenting, but sometimes there's questions of how do you present something or pronounce something, and you can do in Google, pronounce any word, and it will come up how to pronounce that. So I use that with the medical students when we have, like blinatumomab. How do you pronounce blinatumomab? And so there's that's on the web. So that's a little hint. And then double check you followed the rules, because it really is a glimpse of your work and your attention to detail. So let's break that down into little parts. And I've used an abstract from Dr. Cook at City Children's One, who has just done a very nice project on HLH. And so, which is going to be presented next month at the Histiocyte Society meeting in Stockholm. And so your title should be concise. Often there's a word count or a character limit, so you have to follow that rule. You want to summarize the key finding of the abstract in your title, and it should be supported by and reflect your data. So her title is Impact of Presenting Signs and Symptoms and Treatment on Outcomes of Pediatric Patients with HLH in Vietnam. So when I read that, I'm expecting to see in her abstract that she has information on the signs and symptoms and the outcomes of patients who have HLH. And so you want that all to be consistent. Yes.
You'll see in the last slide that all the authors were listed. And just a tip for when you're submitting this online, you'll have to submit the names of all of the authors that you have, the departments that they're from, their formal contact information. And it is much easier to get that. What I usually do is when I send an abstract to my co-authors, I'll say, please confirm your contact information, and being able to do that up front makes it so that you're not scrambling to get that information the day that it's due.
Yeah, because it's not enough time.
Yes.
So introduction, this particular abstract wanted separate sections on introduction, which they called purpose, and different things. So this, but this is pretty standard for everything. So the introduction is usually 3 to 5 sentences, a summary of the background, followed by what is the gap in the field, and what is the your question, hypothesis, purpose, or goal. So as an example, the purpose of this study, or whatever you're doing, is to, the question guiding this study is, and the aim of this is. So that's an example of how Dr. Cook did this was, she has her summary of the background. HLH is a rare disease. We see a lot of it in Ho Chi Minh. Her gap is that outcomes for children with HLH in a resource-limited setting are unclear. And her question or hypothesis is that the goal of her research is to evaluate the association between clinical manifestations, lab features, and treatment with risk of recurrence. That should tell you exactly what you expect to see. And then when you write your methods, it goes back to this. When you write your results, it goes back to this. And when you write your discussion or conclusion, it should go back to this. So it all gets set up the same way. In the methods or approach system, if it's a research study, you want to include the study design type, the setting, the sample size, the measurement tools, and the analysis approach. If you're doing a different kind of project, then the details are a little bit different. So look for examples, and that is the key point. Look at published examples of work that's like yours. So general formula for a clinical study, which is I think what most people in this audience will do, is to have the research design, the patient population that you're studying, your methods, and then the data analysis. And so the example there is, this was a retrospective cohort study. Children were aged less than 16. They met diagnostic criteria for HLH 2004. So that's her research design and her population that she studied. Her research methods, she extracted data from the medical record, entered it in REDCap, and analyzed it with Stata. And then the statistics is generally at the end, and she used mean plus minus standard deviation. So kind of the key things that you do are in this order. When you get to writing the paper, you're going to structure the methods exactly the same way. Just expand it. In the results section, it's important to state the facts. I think this is one of the most common errors I see people make when I review papers, is that people interpret their results in the results section, and that should really be in the discussion. So state just the facts. It should flow directly from the methods and be consistent with the title and your purpose, aims, questions, or hypothesis. If when you get to the results, you find that you have nothing that is in common with your title or your introduction, you need to rewrite your title and your introduction. And I think of it as kind of starting with the big picture and going down to the little details. So my study design, how many patients I have, their demographics, and then the specific findings relating to your questions. Is that how you do it?
Yeah, I would say I think having the kind of inverted triangle in mind is really helpful. And also I think having it mirror the way that you wrote your methods is a good way to conceptualize it. And then I think it's easy, I think your brain kind of more easily moves from your methods into your results if you follow that design. And you'll also see that be reflected in like figures when you do that as part of the manuscript.
Another pearl that I've been told is to make it really as simple and easy to follow as possible. So that's why these patterns that people expect to see are so helpful. Most people who review abstracts or who review papers, it's a volunteer thing that you do usually late at night. And so you want to make sure that you're making it as easy as possible and you keep the person who's reviewing it happy. The worst thing is if they, Dr. Jim Downing, who's the CEO at St. Jude, I was at a workshop he did on this topic, and he's like, there is nothing worse than if I have to set down my coffee, if it's in the morning, or set down my beer if it's at night, and pick up my pen and write a comment. So make it simple for your audience. So this is her results. So she starts with, I had 190 patients, their median age, she gets into the details, and then she goes into the specific points, but she doesn't interpret the data, she's just listing the facts. When you get to the discussion or conclusion, that's where you interpret your results in the context of your stated purpose or question or hypothesis. And so linking it back to what you said the purpose of your study is really important. That will make the person who's evaluating it or reviewing it happy. You want to use the same words as found in the statement of purpose. And then in terms of interpreting it, questions you can ask and write about in this section are the results what you expected? Did you achieve your purpose? If you didn't, that's okay, but you should address why. Like maybe you found something cool and new and surprising, and that's great. How was your question answered? Is it what you expected? Why or why not? It is okay if your hypothesis is wrong. And you address that by saying, surprisingly, we found that blah, 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 blah. However, if your conclusions are inconsistent with the title and the purpose, it probably should be revised so that that all makes sense. It's important to have what the limitations are. So every project has one. Don't omit that part, especially for clinical research. You should, and then you want to end with, why should I care about your results? What does this add to the literature? Because that's what, you want somebody to come to your poster or come to your talk. So tell them why they want to do that. And one way to think about this is, how does my work move the field forward? So Dr. Cook said, this is a rare disease. So she's going back to what she had in the beginning. EBV infection is the most common trigger. It should be treated early. And then she found that serial analysis of the ferritin was her most important marker to follow response and to guide rapid taper of therapy, which is important in a setting like Vietnam where secondary infections are high. I think one thing that can be helpful to remember, because initially the work you're going to be reporting in Vietnam is going to be more descriptive, and that's okay, but take advantage of the fact that you're doing really amazing stuff in a resource limited setting that can be an example for other settings like you. So highlight that instead of shying away from it. And that can make reviewers more likely to send this out or to accept it. A few more pearls for success. Proofread your work, because it's annoying and it makes you look like you're a sloppy scientist when there are typos. Avoid grammar errors. Because English is a second language, have somebody who actually has English as their first language read it. There are some journals who, have you document if English is not the first language that you had somebody read it. There's often a lot of errors in those papers and they're really hard to read. So if you can find somebody that can read it for you where English is their first language, that's helpful. Read it out loud. Ask someone you trust to give feedback, and don't take the feedback personally. It really is to help you do well. Double check the instructions and the guidelines to confirm that your abstract reflects these specifications, and recheck your margins, fonts, type size. I become very obsessive with this. And then I wrote there the ruler test, and I learned this from my thesis advisor. You will be so familiar with this work because you've worked on your abstract and you've wrote it and you've rewritten it and you've rewritten it. And so it's easy to read quickly and to miss little things. And so the ruler effect is essentially you take a ruler and you read it line by line by line by line out loud. So it makes you go slowly so you can pick up errors. And I always find something, at least on my own work. And then also remember that your thinking can evolve as you write your abstract. So take time to make sure the entire abstract makes sense. And if it doesn't, you need to rewrite it. Okay. And then final check before you hit submit. Did you follow the instructions? Include headings exactly as it states. Use short, clear sentences. Only one idea per sentence is helpful. You want to make it simple for the person who's reading it because they're tired and they're volunteering their time. Did you limit your abstract to the word count or character count requirements? Sometimes you have to paste your document or your paragraph into a box online, and it will cut you off if you haven't counted appropriately. Ask someone to edit for English and technically edit your work. And then I also wanted to comment, and that Caitlin got to this, to be sure you submit on time and preferably 24 hours beforehand. Sometimes there's lots of people, one of them, who procrastinate and the system will crash, and that's super stressful. Check the time zones. Like sometimes it's Eastern time, which my 5 o'clock is not, that's not their 5 o'clock. And so they're picky on that, and allow for technical glitches. Any questions about abstracts? Can you see the chat? If there's any, you can also put them in the chat, or you can unmute and ask questions.
No.
Okay, easy breezy. Just follow, it really is a formula to follow.
I think as a trainee, if there's something specific that you want people's feedback on, be really explicit with that when you send it to them for review. Because if it overall looks good, there might not be any extra comments that you get. But if you specifically want somebody to say, are the results, what you would or is this how you would write the results? Just put that very clearly in your email to make sure that you get the kind of feedback that you're really looking for.
Okay. So now we're going to move on to posters. So your abstract got accepted. Congratulations. Now you have to make the poster. The poster is really a concise overview of your project. And the kind of main components are the title. You want to keep that short and sweet. It has to be the same as your abstract. The purpose or introduction, it's the invitation to read your poster. And you can write a paragraph or you can use bullets. Most people are going to be about 3 feet away when they read your poster. And so I find bullets easier and just kind of the main points to read. And I find when I'm walking through a busy poster session, those are the posters I stop at because they're not so overwhelming. The methods or approach, you can either write a description, bullet points again are useful, or you can put it into a graphic or a flow chart, and that can be a really nice way to show it. The results report but don't interpret the data. If you use tables, keep them short and make sure it's actually readable. So a 12-point font, most people can't read from 3 feet away. So use a big enough font that they can read it. Make the figures clear and easy to read. Have descriptive figure legends that tell you what the figure you want people to see in the figure. What does it mean? The discussion or conclusion, try to use bullets with as little punctuation as possible. References are optional in a poster, but you can make those very small fonts. People don't need to read those unless, if they really want them, they can take a picture and come up close. And the acknowledgements of support can also be smaller. In terms of thinking about designing your poster, I find a good place to start is, what is my message? So everything on your poster should relate to that message. And one way to think about that is, what is the one thing you want your audience to learn? And the title of that should summarize that message. All visuals in the text relate to that message. And this is a time where you get to be bold and be explicit. You want to excite people about what you do, because it's often, so the way that this all works is that, people who review articles for journals tend to go to meetings. They tend to go to the posters that are in their content expertise. And if you submit a paper to a journal, they look through their kind of list of reviewers and say, who's an expert in this? And that's who they send it to. So it's very likely that the person who reviews your paper when you publish it has also visited your poster. And so you want to think about that carefully. And that's why I think going to meetings and doing posters and presentations matters. And so thinking about that and being very internally consistent with your data and your conclusions that support your title, support your message is important. Keep your graphics clean and simple. Like, it's hard to read the color combination on the left. It's also hard to read the axis. And so when you're making your figures in Excel or PowerPoint, it's often small. For publications or presentations, you should make it larger. I actually think that the one on the right, the number of I can't read what it is still too small. You want to make it easy to read. And so make those bigger. So usually you have a different set of figures for your poster or your presentations than you do for the paper. Know your audience. Who do you want to come see your poster? And that kind of falls into different groups. At meetings, there are people in your field of specialization, and they'll come to your poster because they want to know what their competition is or they want to learn from that. Then there are people who are fields closely related to you. And those are really helpful people to talk to. Because sometimes you'll think about your own work differently because of talking to somebody who does something kind of parallel. And then sometimes there's people in unrelated fields that will stop at your poster just because it looks interesting. And that can actually be really helpful because they have a very different way often of thinking about things. So just kind of think of who your audience is. And I think the key takeaway when you think about, you could have these different groups of people, is you want it to be easy to read for somebody who is, has a college education, but might not be an expert in your field. So making your message, I kind of tailor my message to that because the people who know what I'm doing will be able to understand it, but making it clear for the people who are smart, but in unrelated fields is probably going to make a nicer poster. I don't know if you have comments on that at all.
Yeah, I will say I've actually enjoyed talking with people who are in unrelated fields when they came to ask about things. You actually get to kind of walk somebody through the experience that you went through when you were doing the research and like what you were thinking. And probably more so than with people who may have a similar career focus. And so I think don't worry if somebody in a different field comes up to you and asks you those types of questions. I actually think they can be really nice conversations to have and give you a lot of new things to potentially think about.
So in a good poster, there will be headings that will make it very easy to scan through the poster. It should be title, the section titles, the figure captions, and think of headings as summaries. And a good way to think about organizing the posters. When I make a poster, I make my title banner, and then I write my subsections, and then I start to put the stuff in it, and that can make it easier to make the poster. You want to use hierarchy, and remember it needs to be readable and be bold, and include things. So this is an example from somebody in our global health program. All of our medical students are required to do a research project in order to graduate. So they've got a nice title that's very clear, and then background, aims, methods, results, and conclusions and acknowledgements. And so making it nice and simple and easy to follow in a logical way from left to right is helpful.
Just one last thing. So sometimes if you're working at a specific institution, they may have a poster template for you to use. If not, you can use something like this as an example, and to save yourself a lot of heartache, there are ways in PowerPoint that you can align all of your different boxes so you don't spend forever trying to make everything line up perfectly just by eyesight. So don't waste time on those little details, because the software can do that for you.
Yeah. And if there are people who are doing posters for some specific meeting, I've shown people how to do that, as has Caitlin, over Zoom. So don't have to reinvent the wheel. In terms of the process of doing a poster, planning takes probably the most time. And then think about the focus, the layout that will make it easy to walk through the poster. Headings, graphics, keep them simple and don't overdo the colors and make it too busy, and allow enough time to edit. And to think about, when I walk up to a poster, and this isn't my area of expertise, I usually ask the author who's standing there, can you walk me through your poster? So you actually want to practice what you're going to say and highlight the key things. It's very, very unusual that people will read word for word everything on your poster. So thinking of a way that you can easily highlight and walk through. So the purpose of my research is to understand X. My aims are 1 and 2. The approach I took is this. These are my key findings, and you walk them through, and these are the conclusions. And you should practice doing that and try to get it down to about a minute. And then they can ask you more questions for what they're useful for. But practicing that is really helpful. Okay, any questions about posters? Okay.
So currently they do quite a lot of electronics poster.
Mm-hmm.
So previously we use a paper one, and the format, the length, and the size of the poster is an issue. Now we do mostly the conference use electronic one.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what it is.
It ends up being about the same. You can still use PowerPoint for that. And for the electronic posters, it's usually a TV, and so you can still think about that, but you still want to think about making it easy to read and all of those things. And the formula for kind of the headings stays pretty the same. So let's move on to, you have really exciting work, and you got selected for a presentation. What is that like? So what are some strategies for a great research presentation? You want to engage your audience and get them interested. You want to organize the talk. And I think, if you take away one thing, think about talks as you're telling a story and not giving a speech. It's much more interesting to listen to a story than to somebody just droning on with a speech. Optimize your delivery, be dynamic, and effectively present data on your slides. And to remember that visuals should be there to help you learn or be engaged and interested and not be distracting. Consider your audience and adapt your story for the setting of the audience. So if I'm invited to speak at a meeting that's for general pediatricians, I'm going to give a slightly different talk than if I'm invited to give a meeting for people who work on lymphoma, because they're going to have different levels of expertise. So think about that. and tailor your talk that way. How to frame a science story? Go ahead.
I would say everybody's going to have a slightly different lens. And if there's something that you can highlight early on in your presentation that connects what you're doing with what their lens is, it kind of gets people on your side earlier in the presentation. And I think that that can be a helpful way to frame your discussion.
Yeah, that's a great point. So in terms of framing a story, what's your question? Why should people care? You don't want to have to make your audience figure out why they care on their own. You should tell them. What did you do? What did you find? And what does it mean? So if you kind of think as you're thinking about your presentation that you're answering those questions, you will likely have a very good talk. So those translate to your title, your background, your methods, your results, discussion, and implications. So same thing, it's really just a recipe and following a recipe that's very accepted and standardized. And then just to highlight that your results, your discussion should be congruent with your methods and your results. So in terms of organizing the talk, I kind of like to think about a train. So your introduction sets the stage for your story and creates drama. You want to be big picture, why this matters, state the question, describe and how you address it. The middle part, so the cars in the train, describe what you did, your data. You don't, even if you've done lots of things, you don't have to show all of it. Show the data that's necessary for the story and choose an order that's most logical to the story. And then the conclusion should summarize the main points and emphasize the implications to the field. It's important to use effective headings and labels. This is probably my biggest pet peeve. So people will show a slide like that on the left where nothing's labeled or the labels are so tiny you can't read them and they don't put a title on or the title doesn't explain the data. Better is to have clear labels that are large enough to read and a title that summarizes the point of the slide. So the point of the slide is that we don't cure everybody with HLH and that's a problem, an unmet need. It can be nice to kind of balance titles that are summaries with titles that are questions. So having a question that summarizes, why you did or prompts why you did the experiment can be useful. And it's nice to mix that up because then it doesn't get boring. Slides should be kept as simple as possible. And I think particularly when English is a second language, there's a tendency because you're nervous and you want to read what's on your slide to use lots of words. And so, keep it simple, makes it easier for the audience and keeps them engaged. A general rule of thumb that's in the literature is aim for 6 lines, 6 words, and avoid complete sentences. So the slide on the left has lots of words that can be boiled down to very simple things. And you can use presenter notes or print out the details of what you want to say. I actually personally prefer to print things. I presented at a meeting in Japan, and when they put my slides in, it turned all of my presenter notes to Japanese, which I don't speak. And so that was a little bit of a panic. And it happened to everybody presenting. You could see people go, and then go. And so thinking about that and practicing your talk enough, particularly if English isn't your first language, is important.
A word about that. Sometimes I don't feel the need to use like the full presenter notes, but when I'm rehearsing, I'll realize that it's kind of, I don't know like where to start my next sentence on the next slide. And so sometimes in the presenter notes, I'll just put like my first 3 words that will like get me into that slide. And it's enough to make that a much smoother transition. And I think that can be really helpful.
And just the next few slides are just some kind of helpful things to remember. So minimize text, use visuals. Half of adult learners are visual learners and have a hard time hearing or reading, processing things while they're reading. Illustrate complex concepts with a figure because it'll get your point across more effectively. Make your talk look professional, and by that, be consistent in the fonts you use, in your color schemes, and the representation of the data, and use fonts that are easy to read. And so in general, people suggest not using Times New Roman or Garamond or anything that has the little extra dots because they're harder on your eyes. And especially since so many things are done on Zoom now, using something like Calibri or Arial that has nice, clean lines is easier for people to read and associate with less distraction and fatigue. And then tell a story. So I was taught just because you did it doesn't mean you need to include it if it distracts. And just because you did it first doesn't mean you have to tell it first. Tell what makes the most interesting story, even if your last piece of data, might be the thing that actually ties it together or sets the stage, or you can put that first. So do what gives a good story. So you want to craft your data into the most compelling and interesting story while being honest. And then tell the story. So don't memorize your speech. Memorize the first part, because usually when you start, you're nervous, and memorize your last slide. And then in between, this is what Caitlin was getting at, is memorize your transitions, like how you get from one part to the next, but then talk through more conversationally the data on the slides. Planning the transitions is helpful. It provides a signal to your audience. So you can use voice and body language to get attention. So you just pause and holding some silence. So like I will count to 5 in my head before I go on to the next thing, or saying something like, next, I'd like to discuss, and move on to the next thing. For a longer talk, you can put in a slide that kind of reminds people where we're at. And so this is an example of that. And then be dynamic. And so things that you can say are, we were surprised, this was unexpected, it was especially exciting. Those are all ways to engage your audience and make it more interesting. And I suggest, like, I sit at meetings and I'm listening to like the famous people give plenary talks. I actually have a little place in my notebook where like, oh, that color combination looks really good, or words that people use that are really compelling and make you excited about their work. Voice, so enthusiasm, passion, pace. Look at the audience. If you're somebody that gets really nervous looking at the audience, then make it look like you're looking at them, but look at the top of people's heads or the back of their chair, but try to engage with the audience. If you're giving a longer talk, moving can be helpful, leaving the podium, and don't overuse the laser pointer. And then I think the most important thing, especially when you're first learning to do this, is to practice and mimic the real event. So the shorter the talk, the longer the feedback and things. Like a 10-minute talk is really hard to do in that time, and they're really strict about it. So at the American Society of Hematology, they have this horrible thing up on the podium that starts flashing yellow when you only have a minute left, and then it turns red and you have to stop. And that's scary. Yeah. So practice. So when I was a postdoc, if someone in our lab was giving a talk and it was a 10-minute talk, my boss would set aside 90 minutes to practice that talk. And they'd give it once, and then we'd go through slide by slide by slide. And I've done that with some of our trainees over Zoom, and to help you learn how to do that well. So take time to practice. Make sure you practice it out loud so you hear how it sounds and all of that. Seek feedback on the presentation, your slides, the level for the audience. Did you sell it? Does it make sense? And allow a couple of days of practice to implement changes. So in summary for this section, engage your audience, get them interested and excited, Organize the talk, but tell it like a story, not like a speech. Optimize your delivery, be as dynamic as you can and excited about you've done all this hard work and it's cool and exciting. Let people know that. Effectively present the data on the slides and use your visuals for learning and not distraction. Any questions on research presentations?
This is just a comment, but if you are going somewhere and it's a presentation where there might be colleagues that you know, sometimes it's helpful to talk with them ahead of time and potentially even plant a question, like if there's time for questions afterwards, because then you kind of get one that's like easy, you know how to answer that question. It gets people talking. And I think it can be an easy way to take a little bit of the edge off.
Yeah. Talking about answering questions is probably helpful because that's the hard part and the scary part at meetings. So, you know, a couple of hints. Sometimes it can be hard to understand what they're asking.
Sure. It's a person.
Yeah, that's the hard part. So it's okay to ask them to restate the question. Or if you're nervous, like sometimes I'm like, I just can't think because I'm anxious about the questions. It makes me nervous, is to restate the question. So say, so I think you are asking whatever you think they are asking. And that gives you time to take a breath and calm down and allows them to clarify, but to give yourself time to process your answer. Sometimes you'll get a question that's just off the wall, isn't related at all to what you talked about, or is just, and sometimes people will ask things that are mean. Mm-hmm. It's okay to what? Yeah, it is completely fine to say, it's nice to give a compliment and then to say, well, that's a really interesting question. We haven't thought about that. I'll have to think about that more. And and I actually have my students practice saying that, like, that's a great question. I hadn't thought about it. I'm not sure what the answer is. Or to give your best guess, be logical, think what it is, but it's okay if you don't know the answer.
I have a question regarding to the be dynamic. I think it's very difficult for the English is not the native speaking. And some of the speakers, I think more of them, they use the speaker notes. Mm-hmm. So if you just follow the speaker notes, sometimes the tone and also it's very hard to get the dynamic on the presentation. So it seems to be not so naturally talking. Mm-hmm. So what is your opinion about that? I'm not very often to use the speaker notes.
I actually discourage people to use the speaker notes because you tend to read them. I think it's helpful when you're practicing, but then you should give your talk at least 2 or 3 times without the speaker notes. So that it's more conversational and so that you feel comfortable enough that you can look up at the audience and engage and not just read. And it's actually fine if your English isn't perfect, but I think being conversational and excited about what you've done, that translates very well. And so, and people are very forgiving about that. So, but I think just reading the notes without any change in your voice, I usually, even if it's cool science, I can't keep engaged. I usually people, you'll see everybody all of a sudden on their phones. So being engaging, even if it's not perfect, is better than just reading in a monotone, is my opinion. I don't know what other people think. Okay.
It's always like a conflict because if you between you prepare the slide, it's no more 6 words, no more 6 sentence slide or something like that. But if you don't have a lot of the word to express, talk, so the people seem to read the slide and then they have to prepare the longer sentence and information on the slide.
Yeah, and that's okay. I mean, I think there's a happy medium, a little bit more. And sometimes it's easier to have it on there. And if longer, make more slides then. And so it doesn't look like so many words. And, and my slides are not perfect on all of them. Some of them have too many words. But I think a lot of people is like, oh, it's a 10-minute talk. You shouldn't have more than 10 slides. I like to split my slides up into smaller bits that are easier for the audience. So I might have 20 slides, but I can get through them in the same amount of time. And so that can be a way around that, where it doesn't look quite as much like you're reading the slides because there's not as many words on them.
I have two comments. So when I've done that, or when I was like very nervous about giving a presentation, I essentially have two versions of my PowerPoint. I have one that has all of my notes in the notes section. And then I have another version that just has like, when I've practiced and I know that I get stumped up somewhere, then I have just that word or that line in my notes. And that's the one that I use to actually present. And I feel like that helps me. Or I'll even put like, if there's an abbreviation that I don't always remember what it is, but I want to make sure I use the full abbreviation, I'll like have that typed out in the notes. And I find that I feel more confident because I have it all in one version and I can practice it all with that one version. But then it helps me not sound so monotone by having the shorter abbreviated version when I'm doing it live.
That's a really good idea. I like that. I've never done that. I like that a lot. Yeah.
And then the other comment is about figures. And so I think that there's a way that you can animate your figures that helps you talk people through things and not just look like you're having a big table on the screen. So don't be afraid, and also look for examples where you see people who have animated figures that kind of talks people through it. Because I think that can be a way to be telling a story rather than feeling like you need to memorize a series of information. Because if I have a table that I show you the first 3 lines that says the survival for drug B is better than drug A, and then in my next section I have like, usually what I'll do is I'll make one table and then I'll make a square that's white and a white outline, and I'll put it over the part of the table that I don't want people to see. And then I'll animate it to disappear when I click my mouse, so that then it shows the next part of the table. So I can say, and then this are the side effects that are associated with this versus this. And so it kind of helps create that dynamic movement. And also it's not just like one slide, but that's the easiest way I found, is to animate that one like white box to disappear.
I was worried about time, so I took out the animation sections, but I think that that's really helpful. The other thing you can do is, if you have a table with a lot of data, is to use a red square that moves you through and your audience through the data. So I'll put, like the red square around the top part, and then, that disappears and it goes to the next part. And so that can be another way to help people follow your story.
It also helps me remember the order that I wanted to talk about things, because I can only, I make sure I hit the points that I have the little box around.
Mm-hmm. But don't overdo it. I think with the animations, like sometimes I'll get slides from a student or a trainee, and there's so many animations. They can take a while. So, okay, so moving on. The last part of this is, actually not so hard. If you've written an abstract, you've presented a poster, or you've given a talk, you essentially have your paper essentially outlined and ready to write. It's just putting those things onto paper. I think one thing that I think brought this topic up is that it is hard to publish papers in a low and middle income setting. It's hard to publish papers in a high income setting, but I think it's harder here. And I think what you should know is that there is growing recognition of that, and there's starting to be a real commitment to increasing equity in research and publication. So our last editorial board meeting for Journal of Peds Hem Onc, we actually decided that we are going to make a very concerted effort to have representation of research from settings like Vietnam and other countries that are, really doing good work and coming up with ways to help people publish in that from those settings. So I think it's going to get a little bit better, but you still have to have good work. We at UCSF actually feel so strongly about this that our vision statement actually has eradicating inequities in cancer research, because we really feel like there is a disparity and an inequity between the ease of publishing in our setting and a setting like here. And so our mission is actually to accompany people in that process to start to make it fair in terms of research. So it is not easy. I think it's important to know that the majority of papers are rejected, whether or not you're from a high income or a low income country. And so you have to send most papers get sent to multiple places, and that's just the process, unfortunately, but it's not impossible. And you can increase your odds of getting accepted by doing some things. And so I wrote this section really thinking about it from the perspective of a reviewer of a journal that includes papers from settings like this. So you need to have a strong cover letter, and I'm going to go through the recipe for that. You do need good data, and it needs to be internally consistent. And I would say that's the most common reason that I reject something from a setting like this, is that the data just doesn't make sense. So having people help with that beforehand is good. It should be easy to read, and it needs to be interesting. It adds knowledge or addresses something novel or a gap in the field. And your job as the author is to point out to me what that actually is. Don't make me think and find it. So writing a successful paper follows the same, essentially the recipe for an abstract or a poster or a presentation. Look at similar papers on your topic as a guide, and preferably in the same journal that you're applying to. There's standard ways to present data. There's standard orders for doing different kinds of papers. So a cohort study, first figures usually the patients, and the table one is the patient details. A randomized control trial has the flow of patients through that. So look at how this has been done in something that's successful, and use that as sort of your roadmap for writing your paper. It's not a time to be creative in terms of how you write that. So, it's the same thing. Reviewers do this late at night, and you want to make it easy. It's helpful to start with a detailed outline and to make your figures. Sometimes you'll change things around or the order once you look at the figures. And I think it's really helpful to discuss that with your mentoring team before you sit down and write the entire thing. People will give you more feedback early in the process, and you feel sort of bad when somebody's worked really hard to write the whole paper versus earlier. I also think that it's really helpful. So what we do with the fellows is when they're getting to this point, we sit down with their in-country mentor and their international content mentor to discuss the paper and the outline so that they've got a roadmap for doing that. The abstract follows the same rules. Be careful of the word count. Check that up front. And the paper should follow the organizational structure and the key points in the abstract so that that's consistent and congruent. The intro is usually 3 to 5 paragraphs. Paragraph 1 is usually the introduction to the problem, the current knowledge in the field, the gap in the field you're addressing it, and why it is important. And that last part, why it's important, is critical. Paragraphs 2, and maybe if there's a third one, are the critical background you need to understand the paper. Remember, one concept per paragraph. So if they need to understand, so my lab, we work on glucocorticoid resistance. If they need to understand what's known about glucocorticoid resistance, we might write one paragraph on that. And if we're looking at a specific signaling pathway, we'll write a paragraph on that. So that's how you want to think about your background. It's not a complete dissertation or a summary of everything in the field, but really the highlights of the key points that help people understand why your work is important. And then the last paragraph in the introduction is a summary of your work and why it matters. So you're kind of previewing or giving them a teaser of why this is cool. I'll give you my slides. And then writing a successful research paper. The next section is the methods. There's also a traditional order that everybody follows for that. So look at the journal and look at ones that have been done. Usually it's the study design, patient inclusion, exclusion criteria. If you had to do informed consent, if you needed IRB or ethical approvals is the first part. The second part is usually how you collected your data. The third part is how you analyze the data. And the last part is the statistical methods. And in this part, it's there's always word counts for papers. And so this is a place where you can be clear and concise. When you get to the results, you want to think of a traditional, there's also a traditional order for clinical studies. So again, look at other papers. For basic science studies, you have more flexibilities to put the data in an order that tells a good story and makes it interesting. So in the context of basic science papers, just because you did an experiment first doesn't mean you need to present it first. Do what makes most sense and is most interesting. And in the results, you don't interpret the results, you give just the facts. In the results, you'll link to your figures or refer to a figure that demonstrates the facts that you say, the sentences you write in your results. So your figures should be clear, concise, legible figure legends. You want to make sure the axes and labels are large enough to read. That's annoying when they're not. The figure legends, look at other papers in the journal. They should include, I would say this is one of the mistakes I see most commonly, especially from papers submitted from countries like Vietnam. So make sure there's a figure number and it's labeled, that's simple. Be able to understand the figure by reading the legend. So the title of the figure should tell you the key points that your data shows. And so it's usually a descriptive summary sentence. And then usually you put that in bold, and then you have a couple of sentences of what you did in your statistical interpretation. So, and that's usually the last sentence. So error bars represent standard error, the mean or standard deviation, and an asterisk in my table means that it's a p-value of less than 0.5 as an example. But that's a very characteristic and standardized order for writing the figure legends. And then when you get to the discussion, this is where you interpret your results in the context of the field. You want to leverage your strengths and highlight what is novel and interesting. One thing that sometimes people from LMIC setting will do is focus on things that you might have seen in other papers, but it's stuff we already know. So highlight the things that are cool and new and interesting that you are doing in a setting where the resources are limited. An example is I was editing Dr. Kim Won Wei's paper on their neuroblastoma experience, and her rates of mucositis were much less because she had a really good protocol for that. So highlighting the things that are exciting, especially in the context of your setting, I think are really important. Always include a discussion of limitations and then link that to how that will lead you to the next steps. So recipe for the discussion, paragraph 1 summarizes the key findings of your results. Paragraph 2 to usually 3 to 5, interpret the key findings, and generally one topic per paragraph, cite supporting literature, discuss. So it really is a discussion of, are your results the same or different from the literature, and are there possible explanations for that? The second to last paragraph of the discussion is usually the limitations, and there's always limitations to the work. In this setting, it's easy. It can be, there are several limitations to our work. Is it from a single center, which may limit it because it might be different in another context? Do you have incomplete data, which often happens in this setting? And that's okay. You just have to acknowledge it. But then you want to put your work in the best possible light. So saying something like, despite these limitations, our work is of value because. And so really hammering home, this is why my work matters. And then the last paragraph is your conclusions and the future directions. Because of this, next we're going to do this. Do's and don'ts from the perspective of a reviewer. Do follow the instructions for that journal, include page numbers, and some journals will have you do a line number. That's really helpful. Proofread for internal consistency. Does your data make sense, and do the numbers add up? And sometimes in that translation from Vietnamese or whatever language to English, things can get lost a little bit. So that's where having somebody review it, preferably with a statistical background, is helpful. Do address in the discussion the gap you highlight in the introduction. If you don't have any data to address that gap, then you need to rewrite the introduction and the abstract. Make sure your figures are high quality and have a title and some description of detail. Highlight why the reader should care. And I think that's actually most important. And then ensure you proofread for English. And that's where having somebody where English is their first language can be helpful.
Go on. I'd like to hear your opinion about what order you approach the different sections, because I feel like I've had different mentors say that they approach writing a paper in different ways. And I often find the most difficult part is the inertia to actually get started.
Yeah. So if you've been kind of going along, and that's why I actually start with the idea and what is the question so everybody does this differently. And I don't know that there's a right or wrong. What I find personally easiest is to think about what is the question or gap in the field that I'm addressing and why should the reader care? Because I want to structure everything around that. I tend to follow the formula then for each of these. I find writing the introduction and how I'm going to set it up is most helpful. I almost always, by the time I've finished the paper, am thinking about it differently and usually have to rewrite the introduction, and that's okay, but at least gets me started. I then like to make my figures, and then once I have my figures, then I write the results, and I always do the discussion last because I find that's the hardest. And a lot changes as you actually write the results and how you think about it. And so if you write the discussion too early, you always have to rewrite it. I don't know if that's helpful. Do you do it that way or differently?
Mostly that way. I feel like some people really encourage the outlining, and one of my mentors is figures first, because that will help you figure out what your story is actually going to look like. I've had somebody similarly tell me that when you're thinking about the discussion, pick 3 things that are your so what of what you're writing, and that kind of addresses your gap question, and know what your 3 things are that you think that you're going to maybe hit on in the discussion, and then use that to help guide you for what you include in your introduction to set the stage for why that mattered.
Yeah. And that's why I usually end up rewriting my introduction. But I just find that thinking about the background in the field and the question is helpful.
Yes.
I like people to do the outlining and do their figures early and at the beginning, because that helps, especially if you're just doing this for the first or second time, that really helps you structure your ideas. And it's easier for me to give somebody feedback at that point before they get into the writing. And then a strong cover letter is really helpful. It should be no more than 2 pages, preferably 1. It should summarize the gap in the field the work addresses. It should summarize the key findings in your paper, and it should highlight why the audience for the specific journal you're sending this to will be interested. And then you want to thank them for their consideration. So this is an example gap. We present our article, list the title for consideration for publication in whatever the journal is. As you know, 80% of the childhood cancer burden globally is in low and middle income countries, where outcomes are poor relative to high income countries. The WHO has made improving outcomes for children with cancer a priority area. So that kind of tells them, ooh, I should be interested in this. Our key findings. As a first step to improve outcomes in Vietnam, we have performed a retrospective analysis of our experience in HLH in order to generate baseline data and identify key issues that can be addressed in future studies. Our key findings are boom, boom, boom. And then you want to tell them why it's interesting. We believe our work will be of great interest to colleagues in similar settings, as well as those in high-income countries who are interested in partnership efforts to decrease disparities between children with cancer in these places. Thank you for your time and consideration. So nice and concise, but it hits all the key things. And when you send a paper in, the first thing that the editors or the sub-editors do is triage. Am I going to send this out for review or not? And about 2/3 of things don't even get sent for review. So having a good cover letter can really increase your chances. I actually probably spend as much time sometimes on cover letters as I do on writing the paper because they matter. Okay, any questions on that?
Because in my country is a developing country, and then is a fee for the public article is very expensive, and the cover letter we issue the recommend classes.
No.
I want, and then know that, I mean, I hate the fact that, and I think journals there's starting to be some efforts and conversations around petitioning that there should be two rates.
Yeah.
There should probably be different ways that we think about papers in those, and that's going to even out over time, but you got to start somewhere. And there's so many important things I think we can learn from this setting as a community that you have to do that. So I probably wouldn't say it then. And then if it gets accepted, then you can ask.
Actually, a lot of the submission system, they have a part for the apply for fee reduction or waive application fee if accepted. It is quite separately application. You should not mention anything about the fee on the cover letter.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, you just want to convince them that you've got cool, exciting data that they want to publish and belongs in their journal. Okay, and then just a little bit on networking at professional meetings, because that networking actually does help you get published and helps you get funding and things. So what is networking? It means building relationships with people or making connections. And why should you do it? You can identify new mentors. When you're more senior, it's new collaborators. It can help to move your career forward. You can get appointed to committees, grant funding, and papers published. And I'm on leadership positions in a couple of different organizations, and we're now wanting, and you're going to get an email, Dr. Lon. We want to have people from LMIC settings on the leadership boards, reviewing articles or those things. So I think there's a real recognition of that. But you want to be the person selected for that, so you need to go and meet people. And so don't be shy. So some tips. Preparation. You want to prepare your elevator speech. And I'm going to show you exactly the template for doing that in a moment, which summarizes your work in less than 3 minutes in a way that's interesting. Bring business cards when you go to conferences, even if you're very junior, that's helpful. Discuss with your mentors which presentations you should go to and which people you should look for. Ask for your mentors to introduce you to potential collaborators or co-mentors. Email people ahead of a big meeting to set up a time to meet with them. And then email the leader of a committee saying you're a junior person, you're interested in this area, and you'd like to get involved. My boss was Kate Mathey, who's a neuroblastoma person, and she wanted us to have a lymphoma person in our group. So she made me email the head of the COG committee, and I was terrified. And he was so flattered and nice, and that ended up working out very nicely for me. And so, and he took time and talked to me. So, the worst they can say is no or not respond, but I would encourage you to do that. A lot of times, very busy people get a lot of emails, so they might miss it. So it's okay to send it a second time. I probably wouldn't do it more than that. The 30-minute or 30-second or the elevator speech, sometimes they teach this as the 30-second commercial, but it's really how do you sell yourself? So should include an introduction, an explanation of your past experience and education, a highlight of your skills, and a clear explanation of your career goals. You want to be positive, have personality, show your passion, and it shouldn't be robotic. And so especially, I think this is another where English is a second language. Practicing it is important. This is more casual, so it's okay if the English isn't perfect, but showing that you're excited is really important. So this is from the American Society of Hematology's career development course. Who are you? My name is Michelle. I specialize in, I'm a pediatric hematologist oncologist. I specialize in leukemia and lymphoma. What do you do? And so I am interested in studying mechanisms of chemotherapy resistance. My goal is to cure every child who walks through the door. I have a background in immunology, which makes me uniquely suited to do this. And then the last part is what contributions are you looking to make? And so thinking through this and kind of practicing this is helpful. So when we do our workshop in Fellows College, we actually have this as pre-work and we make people practice it out loud. But do this with your friends, I think can be helpful. And then tips for networking when you get to a meeting, look people in the eye, practice your handshake, put your name tag where it can be easily read, which is most people will shake hands with their right hand. So if you keep it on your left hand, it doesn't get scrunched when you go to shake their hand. Look confident, don't stand with your arms crossed. Best to have at your sides because it makes you look more approachable. Don't look down at the floor. If someone gives you your card, always read it and make a comment on it. Don't put it in your back pocket because that can be disrespectful in some contexts. And so I find Southeast Asia, people from Southeast Asia do cards better than anyone in the world with respect, but think about that. That's probably for our American fellows. And always hand your cards to others so that it's facing them and easy to read. And then in the moment, ask questions. The people that I get most excited about are inherently curious. And so someone comes to your poster or talks, ask you questions, ask that person something about them. You know, what is your opinion on my work? What do you do? You know, and ask a couple of questions about that, because that really will make you stand out from the vast majority of people who don't do that. And then it's also helpful to read abstracts beforehand, especially in your area of interest, and prepare questions, because that's how you establish collaborations and how you, particularly in pediatrics and in academic pediatrics, it's a small world. And so, you know, collaborations are what makes our jobs fun, but it's also what's going to help move you forward. So take home, take a step-by-step approach to professional writing and speaking. Use as a model similar papers and abstracts. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Tell a story. Why should the reader or listener care? And why does your data matter? How does it move our knowledge forward? Seek input from your mentoring team. Try to have a broad mentoring team. And I think this can be a little daunting, and I think sometimes it feels overwhelming, and I speak English as my first language. I really respect people where that's your second language. But remember to have fun and that you have important data to share and that people want to hear it. They've come to your, they can go to lots of different posters or lots of different presentations, and they've chosen to come to yours. So appreciate that compliment of the work that you've done and enjoy the process. I will stop there. Any questions?
Fantastic. Great. So do our colleagues, if you have any question, you just unmute to speak, or you just send on the chat box or Q&A box. And so thank you very much for a great lecture.
Yeah,
and
hopefully that's
just like 1.5
okay.
1.5 hours. It cover, I think it's almost everything about relating to disseminate the data and the work.
Yeah, and I will share this. We have a team of people from lots of different places that are very willing to help with editing and reading, providing feedback. We feel very strongly that people from our, the first and the last senior author should be people from Vietnam. So don't worry about that. We really want to help you get your work out into the stage and to learn how to do this. And it's very daunting. Like my first paper, God, took me forever to write. And, now it gets much easier, and giving talks gets much easier. It takes practice and just to give yourself that time, but getting some feedback from you.
Yeah, so actually I have have experience in more of the part of the presentation, but I think this is the first time I listened to the tip of the networking. It is a very fantastic, and just 30 seconds for commercial.
Yeah, no, it's really
new concept.
It is. We actually, that's a tiny part. We actually do an entire hour on how to network and how to give a job talk and that kind of stuff, because it really does make a difference. And it actually is fun. So like I have a meeting this fall where it was much cheaper to get an Airbnb than the hotel rooms were ridiculously expensive. And we have 5 women staying together, one from St. Jude, I'm from San Francisco, somebody from Israel, somebody from DC, somebody from Germany, and somebody from Vietnam. So you get to make friends out of this that really are people you interact with for a long time. And I think it's the fun part of academia where we work ridiculously hard a lot of the time.
And then when waiting for our college question, I have one question. I think it should be 2. The first one relating to the discussion session. That could be one of the most difficult part of the writing a paper.
Yes.
We talk about the strength and limitation. Usually we discuss about our limitation, but how to neutral, you don't talk too much about that.
Yeah.
And it's quite difficult because it can like undervalue the work. But if you don't mention to that, that could
Right.
be not.
Structuring that is really important. And in papers that I've read from people here in Vietnam, I would say that my experience has been that they're overly critical. The 2 things that I see most commonly that I think don't help you are writing a lot about things that are kind of common knowledge. Like no one's that interested that your ratio of boys and girls is the same as what's in the literature. We are really interested in the fact that in the context of what you have with more overcrowding, infection, and those things, you have results that are approaching what we see in our setting. And that's super cool. And you should highlight, strengthen that. The results here may not be as good as what we have in the United States, where we have private rooms for every patient and all of that stuff. And that's okay. I think for the limitations, I like to do it as kind of a yin yang kind of thing. So you say the negative, but then put in the positives.
Yeah.
So and you don't have to dwell on it. There are limitations of our work. We're a single center. We do not have access to medications. That's a problem that can be addressed. And so how I would say that is, despite these limitations, our work is of value because we are making improvements. And, we have low abandon, whatever is good, highlight those things. But then you can say, and these limitations highlight places that from a system standpoint, we need to address, so access to medicine or those kinds of things. So you turn them into like what you're going to do next. But I think, and you don't want to do, things that are unfixable, I don't think are work. I don't put those in. So like when you write a grant, they always say, you have to have, potential limitations, but you don't want to highlight the potential limitations that are a fatal flaw.
Yeah, so the second question relating to the networking, and I see one of the sentence you relating to you in that paper published.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a quite sensitive issue, and some of the journal, when you submit, they allow you to choose handling editor,
Mm-hmm.
you choose a reviewer, and of course you have to show some of conflict of interest. And you said that the scientific community, some is quite very small, and you might know almost all the people in the field.
Yeah.
So how can you decide to choose a handling editor or refuse or to choose a reviewer to see? Yeah, of course, whenever you submit, I and even you also hope our work has been accepted, right? So if you get someone could be a reviewer or something like this, but how to avoid the conflict of interest.
That's a great point. It is hard. At the end of the day, you want your paper published,
sure.
And people that have, because of their personal biases, are not going to give you a favorable review, even if it's the most exciting and best work in the world. So I think it's okay to say, I usually do it as who I, would be good, and you choose people that, maybe aren't your best friend, and I think you can't choose somebody you collaborated with, but you can choose people that you know and that you know will be favorable and are that are just generally nice and fair people. You know, I mean, I have had like I know that I've been like somebody who knows me not super well but knows me will recommend me as a reviewer, and you know the work just it doesn't meet the standards, but then I'll work really hard on that review to give a lot of suggestions so that the next place they submit it will. So I choose people that I think it's okay to do that. You know, people who would be, and I usually word it as people who would be potentially excellent reviewers, critical reviewers of this work include blah, 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 blah. Because of conflicts of interest, we would prefer that the paper not be sent to, you don't want to list 10 people, but I've been told no more than 2. I don't know if you've gotten input or feedback on this, Caitlin, yet.
I think I had a little, and you gave me feedback, which was very helpful. I also think that the reality is, and this may not be okay to say, but like a lot of people don't approach it with the same like ethical discussion that we're having here today. And so just be thoughtful that like if there's somebody that you do know is nice and that you do know, you know, you didn't work with them on that, but you know that they're familiar with your field, they know like what you do in general, I think it's very appropriate to include that person. And I think lots of people in small circles will do that a lot. And then, I don't have a ton of experience about who not to recommend, but that was my experience with it too.
Yeah, there's only a couple of people.
And some of the journals, they have a very clear criteria for the reviewer. You have to declare no conflict of interest, no get very acquaintance. But I think in terms of like for small community, if you work together in one project, so it should not be suitable. But if I just know you, so I just refer to, I would like you to review or handing edit my paper, that would be okay.
Yeah, no, I think that's.
But I think sometimes it's like part of the work of the reviewer or editor when you have to decide to recommend ejection one of the paper of the people you know.
Yeah,
I think it's I hate doing that as well. So
it is what it, but you have to be fair.
Yes.
And as long as you can clearly explain your reasons why, I think that, you know, it is fair. I hate rejecting my friends or getting like harsh grant reviews on.
So usually I usually, if I got an invitation for review, if it's a very close and we know well, so usually I refuse first.
If it's somebody that's like I think it is appropriate to review their work. That's a conflict of interest, I think. So I don't think that everybody follows that, but I think most people do. And, you know, and it is interesting. Sometimes you can pick out like how it's written or how they talk, who the reviewer was.
So is there anyone, our college has any question for Professor?
I think you brought up one important point, that our communities are small. Yeah. So it's important to be a nice human being.
I think this topic is very interesting, but it's very clear. Actually, what you saw is a very clear instruction and to follow. I think that's
not until you start to do it that you have questions. Sure. So feel free to email or reach out with questions as you get going with this.
There are no questions. I just have one quick comment. So SIOP, the International Society of Pediatric Oncology, specifically has a global health subsection within their leadership, and they have subgroups within the global health division that focus on different disease processes or different interest groups. All of those usually have a YI that is part of the leadership and helps direct either the agenda or helps participate in the programs of that working group. And so this is a plug. We have one that is the SIOP, like Young LMIC, and it's specifically for young investigators who are working closely with or within a low resource setting. And we have meetings every 2 months where we highlight the work of our members, and we also bring people to come and speak, like more senior people to come and speak with us. From a networking perspective, if there's somebody that you are interested in meeting, it's very easy for us to connect you with people who are also within leadership positions in SIOP. So if anybody's interested, please reach out to me. We can put you in contact with somebody, or we can add you to our WhatsApp group. And on that WhatsApp group, we include a lot of announcements about conferences that are happening in different locations, or if there's like good career development webinars, we put that in the WhatsApp. So it's just a nice extra resource for people, and something that's maybe a little bit more tailored for opportunities that would be fitting. So.
And to build on that, many professional societies, have reduced rates for people from LMIC settings. So take advantage of that, and take advantage of their career development activities. And many organizations are now starting mentoring programs between somebody senior in the field and junior in the field, and take advantage of those, because that's like, if I will invite somebody to write a review with me or those kinds of things. It can be a good way to kind of get your feet established. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a nice weekend.
Okay, so thank you very much
Yeah,
for very comprehensive lecture and very useful tip for us. And we, the main barrier for us, of course, is English. So we will try our best, and I think that's our very clear and detailed instruction and the tip. So that would help our colleagues here to start doing it. And of course, if we have any question, and we hope to have some support. And I think Dr. Lan has a lot of data, and you can see a lot of paper from the South, our college from the South. And then we.
Oh, interesting. Good question.
I would like to ask about citing related evidence, how to avoid only choosing papers that
good
support
question.
our results, ignore the negative other. I
Yeah,
think very interesting.
that's a really interesting question. Nice. So a couple of things about references. You want to make sure you have the most up-to-date references. So in PubMed, you can put in a reference. Like oftentimes what comes up with Google isn't the most up-to-date or relevant reference. And I'll often notice that the best references aren't included. So put it into PubMed and then sort by references by year. And that can be helpful to make sure you have the right reference. If there are references that are negative, that don't fit, that goes in the discussion. So it's best to say, so-and-so had results that were different from ours. It's unclear why. Our populations are different. And that's where asking your mentors can be helpful to try to think about how to write about that. But if you ignore it, your paper will get rejected because the reviewer will recognize that.
Yeah,
or they'll critique you and say, omitted this reference, why, and make you discuss it in the resubmission.
And actually, she is my resident, and we also discussed about how to writing the discussion for one paper we just submitted. And I mean, the question here is how we ourselves to avoid our bias to choose just only the supporting evidence to our result and try to ignore the negative one. Actually, it does happen.
Yeah.
When we review the paper, it always happens.
Yeah. So that's where having journal clubs is helpful. And I have templates that we use for the journal clubs that teach you how to read different kinds of literature, which I'm happy to share. It could be useful. We've piloted them in Ho Chi Minh, and it's been great. And we use them for our medical students to learn how to read papers critically. I think you do have to be aware of your biases, and the best way to do that is to do a thorough literature search to make sure you know everything that's out there, and that you're being as comprehensive as possible. A lot of journals will limit how many, articles you can have. So choosing kind of the most high profile ones is, I think, okay. But if there's something that's in direct competition or disagrees, or you have different, results that are different, that's actually kind of interesting, and you should write about it in the discussion.
Yeah, sure. All right. So is there any question? I think it's no. So
Okay.
once again, thank you very much.
Yeah, my pleasure. It was fun.
And thank you, Dr. Lan, and to Dr. Lan. And,
All because Dr. Lan asked the question.
A long day.
they were long days. So have a nice weekend. So you will have
Tomorrow
the
we visit the Halong